morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from today. My name is Alicia Baca, and I serve as the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies at The Ohio State University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth session of Bodies in Focus, Emerging Scholars on Body Studies. Bodies in Focus is part of a multi-year initiative supported by the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies in collaboration with over 10 regional study centers in the United States. That said, I'd like to thank our co-sponsoring institutions and our scholarly consultants for their support in this endeavor. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to my colleagues Zsuzsana Namagdo at the University of Pittsburgh, Jennifer Tischler and Sarah Lomash-Flesch at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Emma Pratt at Ohio State for their organizational support. As a reminder, we have 90 minutes allocated for today's session, with audience Q&A reserved for the last 30 minutes. Audience members will have the opportunity to share questions and comments using Zoom's Q&A function, but we can also unmute audience members upon request to facilitate ADA access. Please use Zoom's use Zoom's raise hand function to ask to be unmuted. Additionally, all panels in this series will be recorded and captioned automatically via Zoom during each session. Subsequently, recordings will be professionally captioned and made available a few days after each session on the program pages of the 3 organizing centers. If you have any questions about accessibility or wish to request other accommodations for any future sessions, please contact cees@osu.edu 2 weeks ahead of time. And that is CSEEES@osu.edu. And my colleague Sarah will go ahead and drop that in the chat momentarily. Now, let me introduce you to our moderator for today's panel. Dr. Pavel Levitsky is currently an independent scholar, but he previously served as the Associate Director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. Previously, he was a lecturer and researcher at the Chair for Comparative Central European Studies at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt. Dr. Levitsky's research interests cover embodiments of Europe and Europeanization from race-critical, gender and post-colonial and post-imperial perspectives. Among his many publications, let me mention his ethnography titled EU Space and the Euroclass, Modernity, Nationality, and Lifestyle Among Eurocrats in Brussels, published by Columbia University Press in 2018, and a co-edited special issue on European bodies for the Anthropological Journal of European Cultures. Much of his research also covers HIV-positive migrants, struggles for EU citizenship, and the emergence of gray zones in the EU. Next, I will introduce our panelists. Masha Bekatova is a PhD student at Humboldt University in Berlin, where she is finishing her dissertation titled No Name Diaspora, Queer Eastern European and Central Asian Migrants in Germany Beyond Invisibility and Self-Exotization. Her publications focus on translingualism, intersectional feminism, queer activisms, and marginalized literatures. Previously, Masha was also a recipient of the Rosa Luxemburg Scholarship, and recently she joined the editorial board of Feminist Critique as a co-editor. Our second panelist is Alexa Kurmanov, who is a doctoral candidate in the anthropology department at the University of California, Berkeley. Their research focuses on trans advocacy in Kyrgyzstan through the lens of Black feminist theorization and methods of intersectionality. They examine ways in which the categories of woman and man in post-socialist Kyrgyzstan are reconstructed by state and public discourse, and how the trans community navigates, contests, and rearticulates notions of gender and sex in the everyday. Our third panelist is independent scholar Oksana Potapova. Born and raised in the east of Ukraine, Oksana has been involved in addressing the aftermath of the conflict in Donbass since 2014. In 2015, Oksana co-founded Theater for Dialogue and the NGO and women's initiative One of Us, where she was using community theater and feminist pedagogy to build dialogue and cohesion and to advocate for the rights of internally displaced and other marginalized groups of women at the national and international level. This experience led to her interest in embodied feminist methodologies. Oksana combines activism with research and advocacy for feminist peace and grassroots movement building in Ukraine. In September 2021, she completed a master's program in gender, peace, and security at the London School of Economics. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Oksana has continued her research, advocacy, and activism, focusing on intersectional gendered impacts of the war and building solidarities around new realities of peace and security in Ukraine and in the region. And our last speaker, Wolhave Berlovic, is a PhD candidate in sociocultural anthropology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her research centers on disability, aging, and gender experiences in protest movement activism and care in Belarus and political exile. Volha graduated from the Belarusian State University and received a master's degree in sociology at the Higher School of Economics, where she worked as a senior lecturer for the School of Media and as a research fellow for the International Laboratory for Social Integration Research. She has co-authored papers inspired by collaborative research projects and published in peer-reviewed journals including Feminist Anthropology, Sexuality and Culture, and the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. And with that, I will go ahead and pass the mic off to Pavel.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah and Jennifer, for organizing, and thank you, Shusha. Thank you to the centers, and thank you, obviously, to our wonderful panelists today for accepting our invitation. I think most of us are anthropologists, but maybe I will not narrow down the whole discussion. I will make a short introduction and then we will move on to contribution of each panelist, and then we will try to create a little discussion, and then of course everyone is invited to pose questions to panelists and join the conversation. I am happy to be the moderator of this session today, which scholars working in and on broadly defined Central and Eastern Europe or post-socialist or post-Soviet space in conjunction with broadly defined body and or embodiment. As you will witness, our contributors today cover a broad range of topics, perspectives, research fields, and theoretical backgrounds. However, preparing this session, we noticed that the common ground and what everyone is grappling with is epistemology from the body. While it has been something that scholars in social and cultural sciences have been discussing for quite a while now, there are new methodological and conceptual perspectives that enrich this topic, and they give it a new twist. In our preparatory meeting, we discussed autoethnography and positionality, as well as black boxes of production of ethnographic knowledge about the body. Now, both body and as a source of knowledge and the region that we are focusing here on, at least at first glance, do not belong to the quote unquote legitimate and mainstream places of dominant conceptual work. And I don't know if any one of you know, there is a discussion of Michał Buchowski and Chris Hahn from mid-2000s about the hierarchies of knowledge and the position of Central and Eastern European anthropology within theoretical production, world theoretical production in anthropology. Body as a topic in anthropology had experienced its heydays at the beginning of 2000s, but since then it lost a lot of its appeal. And only now it seems to come back as a topic of articles in academic journals, hence probably this panel today or the whole series. Decades of that's a question mark, isolation of the region seems to have left deep scars on or gaps, both in knowledge production and in perception, despite magnificent work that is being done, for example, showing how the region contributed to global imperial dynamics. And I mean here Manuela Boatka and Anca Parvulescu, just for example. Epistemology from the body is seen as too singular and hence illegitimate for any theorization. And the geographical region that we talk about is still often only a cultural and social space that provides empirical material, ethnography, to make broader claims about culture and society. With just few exceptions, and thankfully this is changing rapidly, we are witnessing inclusion of body and the region in global in the global theoretical production, culture and social sciences. It is this situation of political economy of theory production that is our point of departure here, in a way, double marginalization. Yet the work of our scholars, contributors today proves differently. They show how the body and the region, with its historical, cultural, social, and political specificity, in context of global circulation of racist and gender discourses, and development of new perspectives on care in times of war, can contribute to feminist, race-critical care or disability studies, performance studies, to intersectionality, and to discussions on methodology and ethnography or in anthropology. Two intertwined and entangled topics are particularly revealing here: epistemology and methodology. On one hand, how we produce knowledge about the region, and on the other, about the body and accompanying categories such as race, class, gender, disability, affects and emotions, bodily experiences and performances, as well as solidarities. What can we contribute to the broader epistemology and social sciences? On the other hand, how we come to this knowledge, how do we do our observation, and where, and what becomes relevant in the research process on body? The contributions to today's discussion show how body enters and interacts or relates to space, time, language, how it conveys and evokes affects and emotion, and how it's a source of solidarity and care. They show how body can be a source of new conceptual and methodological considerations. Additionally, what joins many of our contributors are their struggles, discussions, and thoughts about positionality and autoethnography that help to reveal the way knowledge about bodies in and from the region is produced. This unpacking of black boxes of knowledge production about the body in and through positionality, autoethnography, and relationality entails three research practices: reading, observing, and writing about what I call here bodily signs. Oksana Potapova, one of our contributors and our first speaker, will call it today embodiment or bodily performances. She will also talk about arts-based bodily practice. Unpacking of black boxes means also observing and ethnographizing own body and its performances or movements in space, we call research field, as Alexa will show in her contribution. And she is our second speaker today. Our third speaker, Masha, will focus on body language relation, and on language performances. We will also hear how communities that we do research with speak about their bodies in their own way, as Volha will show us in her contribution. The epistemological and methodological considerations give way to the discussion about the region and show how body is liberating, emancipating, contributing to solidarities, and empowering. We will see how body and space called Central and Eastern Europe or post-Soviet or Eurasia can contribute significantly to our perspectives on care, depletion, and resistances, on how race is entangled with space, and how focus on bodies in and from the region can contribute to discussions on global circulation of racist discourses, or how bodily and language performances reflect own position in hierarchies of knowledge production and simultaneously of the region itself, and can queer dominant or universalizing theories on gender and sexuality. Last but not least, we will see how focus on body and affects and emotions can give us insights into paths of solidarity and care in times of war. And with this short introduction, I'm going to give space and floor to our first speaker, Oksana. Oksana, thank you for being with us, and we're happy to listen to you. Thanks.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you again for the invitation. It has been a very moving and a really honorable experience of preparing for this panel. As we discussed, many of us work with embodiment from our autoethnographic positionalities and experiences. And even though we theorize, I think a lot of the knowledge that we produce is embedded in very concrete lived realities. Before I proceed with the text of the presentation that I prepared, I want to start with something very concrete, a story that I felt moved to share today, that contextualizes the work that I'm doing as well on body as a method and as a site of knowledge about war and peace. I'm a scholar from Ukraine, and I'm studying mostly the context of Ukraine and Ukrainian activists living internationally and in Ukraine. And I just want to draw attention to the fact that today is day 1072 of the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, and more than 10 years of hybrid armed violence of Russia in Ukraine. It is one of the many sites of war that is going on today. Some of them are more or less mediated and brought to our awareness, but no less real, no less affecting the bodies and relationships and families. Just yesterday, many of my close community and friends learned the news that an artist, a musician, Nika Zenova, learned about the death of both of her parents by Russian drone in Sumy by recognizing their apartment on the news because she saw the pattern of the wallpaper on the wall. She had not heard from them until she learned the news that both of her parents, unfortunately, were killed by that drone. And as moving as this individual story may be, it especially affects most of us when we feel like we recognize ourselves in it. To me personally, this story is also an illustration of everyday attacks on the body that war and violence are, as I will also theorize. It is also an illustration of trans-border and transgenerational care relations that many of us are very entangled in. Many scholars from Ukraine and of Ukraine are now based internationally, but are still connected to families and community members back home. And news like this can strike any one of us. And I think this makes the study of the body as a site of violence, as a site of resistance, as a site of knowledge, even more important on the transnational level, because it's not just about where our body is placed, but how we are connected on a collective level to so many different bodies that are being swamped by violence. And I'm thinking now also about political violence, of course, in the US and in other contexts where far-right forces are coming into power. I took a lot of time of my presentation to politicize this, but I hope that it will set the tone also for our discussion and its relevance. What I will share later is a presentation of my work in progress and engagement in literature of feminist epistemologies of war and peace that encompasses analysis of social reproduction, decoloniality, and feminist peace studies, and intersecting bodies of literature, and positions feminist activists and feminist scholars as those who are both embedded in the work of care, in the work of social reproduction, and in the work of knowledge making. And as a result, are subject to depletion, as feminist political economists theorize it, through that work of care and through lack of resources on the individual and collective level that they are exposed to. Embodiment, in my exploration, is both a site of knowledge from which we understand violence, war, depletion, as well as a method which enables us to uncover marginalized and invisible knowledges. A few words on embodiment as a method and as a form of conceptual analysis of war and peace, which is what I'm exploring. This is an intervention that is presented by feminist studies of war and peace that point out that research of wars usually tends to remain abstract, focusing on norms, institutions, and laws, while omitting the everyday, the mundane, and embodied perspectives. And feminist peace research seeks to fill that gap through offering conceptualizations of the body, vulnerability, and embodiment as a key to theorizing violence and peace. One of the prominent scholars is Christine Sylvester, who argues that engaging with people's experiences of war is essential to understanding war as a phenomenon and as an institution, claiming that, quote, war cannot be fully apprehended unless it is studied from people's physical, emotional, and social experiences, not only down from high politics, end of quote. Places that sweep blood, tears, and laughter away, or assign those things to some other field. Taira Verinen, also a prominent Nordic scholar of embodied peacebuilding, claims that when bodies are seen as agents of sense-making rather than only as objects of study, it can offer us possibilities of enactment of agency and restoration from the injury of war. Here, I will briefly invoke some of my colleagues who have theorized and made interventions into knowledge production and their own experience as scholars of Ukraine and from Ukraine, producing that knowledge in times of war and violence, and attempting to fill an epistemic gap of the region that Pavel also referred to. This gap has been identified before 2022 and kind of made even more visible by feminist scholars, decolonial scholars, scholars of peace and security that mostly theorized Eastern Europe either through the position of the West or as sphere of influence of Russia. And Teresa Handel, for example, makes an intervention claiming that, among other scholars, that the region can be placed in the inter-imperiality, being affected by multiple empires, and also the consequent violence can also be theorized as such. Two interesting and impactful texts in this regard that I've engaged with are the text by Darya Cymbaluk in 2023, titled "What My Body Taught Me About Being a Scholar of Ukraine and from Ukraine in Times of Russia's War of Aggression," where she dives into an autoethnographic account of her academic engagement with decolonial knowledge making, and claims that, again, I quote, "These days, I do not worry if the stories I share as a scholar of Ukraine and from Ukraine are seen as emotional or personal. In fact, I embrace it. I want my stories to move. Speaking and writing about Ukraine has been a form of weeping for me, and I want you to weep with me. I believe it is this knowledge coming from the passions of our bodies that mobilizes us to bring justice." And the second text that I also quote quite extensively is Bogdana Kurylo, also of 2023, who provides an autoethnographic account of embodied living through full-scale invasion being placed in the British academia. Encountering systemic practices of West-splaining, which she describes as a byproduct of the systematic devaluation and dismissal of the voices of Ukrainians and other post-colonized subjects from the region, constituting a form of epistemic violence. I follow these scholars and I take this exploration a step further and argue that the work of resistance epistemically as an activist and practically is not only important in the moments of attention to a specific context of war. However, it is extremely important to look at it from a extended temporal perspective. And this is where the concept of depletion, which is introduced by feminist political economists, is useful. The most prominent scholar who has theorized depletion, and I have 1 minute to talk about it more, hopefully maybe in the discussion I will expand it, is Shirin Rai, whose book The Human Cost of Care came out in September 2024, talks about depletion as an unseen harm, structural and individual harm to individuals and communities that are engaged in the work of care that is unaccounted and unrecognized. She also looks at several layers of harm that depletion through care work places on the bodies, creating physical harm, mental harm, as well as on communities, leading to shrinking of spaces and resources, and on societies overall. Her suggestions to counter that look at reversal of depletion through channeling resources, but also through transformation of economic and social systems that account the invisible care work that communities do. my main argument that I'm trying to build through exploration, theoretical engagement, and hopefully later on methodological engagement with communities is that looking at the work of care that is intertwined with the work of knowledge production, oftentimes that marginalized subjects perform, needs to be looked at through the long-term lens of depletion in order to understand what are the impacts of war, violence, and colonial violence over time, not only in moments of crisis and immediate reaction and solidarity, but also when this violence is prolonged. It also impacts the temporality and the type of our solidarity that we can build and extend, and shift our understanding of how long and what types of resource mobilizations we need in order to sustain ourselves and our communities when we take into account the harm of depletion. I think I'm out of time, but I hope that there will be chance through questions and discussion to explore this further. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Oksana. Wonderful. Thank you so much for setting the scene with embodiment, but also the super interesting, and I hope we will talk about it, the concept of depletion. We are moving quickly to our another speaker, Alexa. Alexa, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Also, thank you for the invitation to come and speak today. I basically will try to also incorporate some of the things that Oksana said, so we kind of tied in together. Thinking about the violence of symbolism and how people embody certain signs and what real life effects and concrete effects that has on them, but also about myself as embodying certain signs in the space of my ethnographic work and fieldwork. So yeah, so today I'll just explore a few methods and frameworks from anthropology and Black studies that have shaped my research in Kyrgyzstan. And my work specifically focuses on politics of queer visibility and erasure, both within and outside queer communities, as well as within the broader local feminist movements. But throughout my research process so far, at this point of like dissertating, I've been grappling with an uncomfortable tension between my body as racialized, gendered, and sometimes ungendered, and fieldwork itself, but also when I'm shuffling, also beyond fieldwork. So when I'm shuffling through the materials, be it field notes, photos, or while listening to interviews. So this tension has primarily revolved around a central question, which is how do I write the Black body or the Black ethnographic self into field work? So the influences that I kind of have and the guides that I have at this point, and I'm very grateful for them, is mostly from Black feminist scholarship, and broadly speaking, including Black studies and feminist anthropology, which offers rigorous and thoughtful analysis to this challenge. They provide critical tools for navigating the complex tension of being a marginalized subject, writing about other marginalized communities and subjects. And so they also offer insights into the ways that symbolism or markers that the ethnographer or writer embody shift and become reified depending on context, or expectations to perform one's embodied cultural, racial, ethnic, gendered markers because of what is understood to be a normalized attribute that is attached to that body. So right now I'm kind of thinking with older texts and scholarship, or more foundational scholarship from Black feminist theory, such as June Jordan and her report from the Bahamas. She actually was a professor of English at the UC Berkeley, but she took a lot of courses actually in anthropology. So her work on vacationing in a post-colonial Bahamas as a Black American is helpful for revealing what it means to embody American imperialism or as an embodiment of a tourist or a guest, and what that says about race, class, gender, and the limits of solidarity within the category of Blackness itself. And so I kind of draw on her work, but also other autoethnographic works. Like I said, she's not an anthropologist per se by trade, but her approach and her writing is very autoethnographic, which I think across Black feminist scholarship you can find. So like I said, autoethnography is one approach that I draw on when doing my research. And so because it's a method that I think both a method and a style, writing style, that deeply engages with how people relate to their own bodies and with the symbolism that their bodies often carry, and in particular, the symbolism that Black bodies carry. And at times the symbolism can misplace, misname, and as Fanon says, one could be responsible not just for their own body, but also for their entire race and ancestors. Another example I'm thinking of that influences my work, of course, is Zora Neale Hurston, who often kind of straddled these lines between insider and outsider. And her work, especially Mules and Men, really highlights how, like, putting her body in the text highlights how the body changes via context. So her body is marked not only by space when she leaves the community that she was born in to go study in New York under Franz Boas and then coming back. So this marks her body geographically. It changes her status, social status within the community. And it also reveals a lot of things about the community itself. And drawing it more into the post-socialist context or the Soviet context, I'm thinking of Audre Lorde's notes as well, notes from a trip to Russia, where her writing is very affective, and the body is centered. So she uses her body senses as well. It's very sensorial to critique hierarchies that she observes in both US and when she's visiting Moscow, and the relationship between Moscow and Tashkent. So her body, or her embodiment of Blackness, of other signs, of other markers, actually she uses that to analyze, and these things reveal kind of these unspoken norms and silences around race and queerness in particular. So I think that these scholars illustrate how the body and lived experience scaffolds or can scaffold broader critiques and analysis. And so in my own work, my body continually becomes a question, or becomes the question, right? Kind of what happens when you throw a Black body into a place in which people don't assume it should be. And what kind of questions come out of that? What are the limits to solidarity in that regard? And so when I listen to interviews or shift through my field notes, I'm reminded of like how my own racialized body and the visual fact of my Blackness shapes the way people conceptualize race and gender in Kyrgyzstan, or more broadly in Central Asia. And what does it mean to actually navigate the streets as someone who is hypervisible? So thinking through these lenses has helped me think about how, in particular, the queer community, or trans people in particular, or bodies that are non-gender conforming, are navigating the streets like the everyday, essentially, and a place in which, you know, has a history of egalitarianism or perceived egalitarianism and social Soviet internationalism, or in a place in which kind of queerness was a private situation. So thinking about that now, and also like, how do queer individuals obscure their bodies? So even my practice of obscuring my body in the field work has influenced questions about how community members there also practice obscuring the body, or how do people read queerness in general? What is queer? So I've kind of taken my experiences with Blackness in the field, but also being marked as a queer body in the field, because again, you know, there are certain things that mark me as queer there that wouldn't mark me as queer necessarily in the United States. So thinking about those things, and also kind of the violence of anti-gender discourses, global anti-gender discourses, and global discourses of Blackness and depictions of Blackness, and how they affect local understandings of gender and race, and how people navigate this in the everyday. So yeah, I was pretty short, but this is what I'm thinking about in my dissertation. And I think these are the things that focusing on the body and embodiment can really bring out. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Alexa. Yeah, very interesting. What I memorized is visibility of queerness, and also hiding it, coming from Poland, living in Germany. That's also something that I've been working of course, thinking about being queer. But it's, yeah, maybe we'll talk. We will have the opportunity to talk about it later. Masha, it's your turn now.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you very much for hosting us, and for the kind invitation to this panel. I'm going to read you some condensed and selected quotation from my autoethnographic essay, Methodology of Surgic, published in Lambda Nordica in 2022, which I actually never presented except once talking with students about it. And in this paper, I have tried to do two things: to connect my migrant experience in Germany to my post-colonial positionality of being born in the Russified region of Eastern Ukraine, and to challenge the linguistic norms in the English-speaking academia. I will start with reading, and afterwards I will say a few contextualizing remarks of how I view also this text from 2025. If I could trust the space between the languages and cultures and borders, if this gap could become a speakable space inhabited by living creatures, by funny and authentic stories, probably it might be not a text accepted by a peer-reviewed academical journal. But maybe such writing could heal the pain of self-recognition. In multiplicity of creative writing workshops I've attended and hosted myself in the last years, this is something people end up talking about again and again: giving the voice to the marginalized, raising the voice against injustice, voicing the void. What if the voice I could raise in English feels blunt and jejune? What if to raise my voice I ought to Google 2 words from the sentence I intend to speak? What if to raise my voice I translate myself to sterile unrecognizability? What if to raise my voice I have to pay someone who proofreads my insufficient wording? The originality, freshness, speed, and connectedness to an emotion with which I speak in my first languages is different from stocking and slow expression in foreign languages such as English. Language is an emotional, a dialogical, and bodily issue. It is not simply a system of science, as post-structuralists have worked out, not just a communication means. A language is a heart and a stomach, and a gesture and a heat and a tremor and a song. A broken language is a dirty and sexy and tabooed matter. This border is inscribed in my речевой аппарат. I googled the proper translation. Voice box, larynx, mechanical apparatus necessary for speech. If I pronounce the word border, you will most likely recognize me as a Russian, which I'm not. This border is classed, is gendered, is ethnicized. The voice box with a strong rolling r in combination with certain habitus can provoke imaginations of a Russian whore. In my case, a struggle with Eastern European femininity was never a universal sisterhood metaphor. It was mostly a stigma. Stigma my mother wore with shame walking back in the late nights after working as a waitress in a restaurant in a small German city and being catcalled due to her yellow bleached blonde hair. Stigma I have encountered at the airport of Tel Aviv while still carrying my old Ukrainian passport, which made the border officer immediately think that I entered the country with the idea of immigrating as a sex worker. At that time, I was working at a university in Berlin as a student tutor. But something in my appearance made the border officer doubt my intention to enter the land as tourist. The linguistic border of an accent is connected to sexualized stereotypes. The voice box is a Pandora box. Opening my mouth, I risk being stereotypized. In my box, there is a g, fricative g, typical to Belarusian, Ukrainian languages, and Southern Russian dialects. Bodies are taxonomized and divided into those speaking properly and those who fail. Speaking bodies are connected to work, classes, possibilities, salaries, borders. I was born into the unspeakability of surjik, a Ukrainian-Russian mix. Surjik is mostly addressed in literature as a social act. I was socialized into broken migrant German, Migrantendeutsch. This is where I always come back if I get emotional from my PhD research. This is what I'm thinking about while reading decolonial thinkers. Surjik is my very personal standpoint from where I can theorize and analyze the social reality. For about 10 years, I'm struggling with difficulties applying Western queer theories to the so-called post-Soviet contexts, and such trajectory always leads to a self-colonizing sadness of we don't have our own theories. But recently, I understood I do not need the Western genealogies of queerness. Surjik is my very first, very bodily, very localized queerness. There will be no home for me, neither in Ukrainian, nor in Russian, nor in English, nor in German. There will be no home anymore, especially after 2014, where, when the Ukrainian regions where people do speak Surjik were colonized by Russia. There will be no home in Western-centering discourses, especially after I realized that it was not me incapable to integrate in Germany, but the very concept of integration, an unrealistic Eurocentric imaginary. Between a teenaged queer migrant who was so much into writing, who had the feeling of losing the language, the main tool of interacting with the world and capturing beauty and pain, and an author who inspires others to write exactly as they think in a lived, contemporary, mixed, and weird language are 17 years. Are pages and pages and trains and buses and planes and universities and demonstrations and blogs and letters and conversations and lost possibilities to speak up. Between these two, there is a grief of never having owned a discourse, grief of never having been so entitled and sure in one's language as are those who have more linear linguistic biographies. Grief of knowledge that for some listeners, this voice box indicates dampness, poverty, violence. To make it clear, Surjik is one of the countless mixed languages, a mix of Ukrainian with Russian or Ukrainian with another language. It can have different percentages and forms, and probably if you are not speaking both languages, you might even not be able to identify this as Surjik. What if instead of hiding my Surjik and reproducing the dichotomy of high and low, Surjik could become a methodological tool for exploring one's own locality, positionality, and ability to see a problem from multiple points of view at the same time? Maybe it is possible to think Surjik not only as a linguistical positionality, but as an epistemological and methodological idea, which could be used not only by those whose first language is Surjik. Methodology of Surjik invites us to embrace our mixed languages and to see the light through the cracks of being an outcast of normative literary or linguistic context. Methodology of Surjik indicates an increased multilingual and transcultural complexity, which is already lived by so many people, but still must be proofread and straightened into the formal, unambiguous styles of monolingualisms. Methodology of Surjik inspires those who cannot speak neither their mother tongue nor the post-colonial or post-imperial linguas francas properly, and have no feeling of discursive power in their daily language, not only to speak up, it allows them to write poetry and academical essays, to write exactly from this shameful and insufficient, funny and awkward, homely and private language. Here I finish the reading, and I want to share some thoughts that academical linguists and migrant activists from various contexts have researched and increased the values of so-called pidgin languages, mixed languages. And my best inspiration across the years was Gloria Antaldúa. In her classical La Frontera, she writes, "We are your linguistic nightmare, your linguistic aberration." Coming back to Antaldúa's praise of untranslatability, we can see how she is connecting the minoritarian linguistic performance to the sense of identity and queer body already in the 80s, and how she underlines the affective dimension of it. And in my essay, I also quote her. When I look back to my paper, which was written 2021, some months before the full-scale invasion, I remember that move to center Surjik as something peripheral, and when the essay was going through the publishing process in the beginning of 2022, I already sensed fear how to deal with this heritage of a mixed language. And looking on it from 2025, I realized I would have written it in a different way with the knowledge I have now, maybe putting more emphasis on the Russification history of Ukraine. And also I would for sure trying to incorporate other multilingual stories of Ukraine. I have the feeling I have written it back then for the Western reader and for the diasporic reader like me, and especially for people from different diasporas for whom I wanted to explain this complex post-colonial situation of borderlands I came from. It would be interesting how the text would have changed if I had addressed it directly Ukrainians, those who are using Surjik and those who are fighting it. I would also work now with the fact that recently some texts got translated into Surjik and some academic publications and zines were published in it. To sum up, I want to highlight that Surjik in methodology relates to body politics, the topic of our panel, and to the particular region. The affective and bodily dimension of reclaiming a mixed language still has to be explored, and especially in times of multiple crises and dichotomic thinking produced by it. There may be a valuable analytical resource in turning to such languages as Surjik without praising false hybridity, and of course with the thought of structural inequalities which brought such languages into existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Masha. Yeah, well, I think looking at the clock, I'm just gonna give voice to Vola. The floor is yours, Vola.
Thank you so much, Pavel. Thank you all for this extraordinary, rich conversation. I learned so much. I entered this conversation as a scholar of disability, and we'll talk about how the ethnography that I'm building with Belarusian older women and disability communities in exile informs some, I think, important perspectives how we can root knowledge in bodily experiences, as many of you talked about today. I engaged in disability studies by learning from my family experience of disability care, and while practicing and participating in the world making that allows my twin nieces with cerebral palsy to socialize and move beyond stigma, I learned how embodiment and embodied care are central for deeper understanding of how bodies are interdependent in both favorable and unfavorable ways, as Oksana mentioned in this conversation in the beginning. Like, for example, when parents move with their children with disabilities across city and they navigate these inaccessible environments by pushing the limits of their own bodies. And that this meant, like many examples that I witnessed and I participated in some practices of care, proved this interconnectedness, which is very complicated, how bodies are interconnected in care. My decision to work with older women and disability communities in exile also was informed by shared experiences of an anti-authoritarian resistance in Belarus in the 2020 uprising, when I witnessed how care for bodies exposed to police violence empowered massive political mobilization. So I'm thinking about the questions: how does care push the limits of our bodies, maintain or change the ways we depend on each other, and create a hierarchy of needs we can or cannot respond to, can or cannot help with? And how do we negotiate it with others and our own bodies? How do bodies experience deprivation of care and create ways to resist and sustain everyday living, especially in the moment of crisis and violence and war we are witnessing in the region and worldwide? I think about these questions through the lens of ethnography that I'm doing with communities, forced migrants, Belarusian migrants in Poland and Lithuania. And I want to share some reflexive notes that I think respond to the question which is central for this Bodies in Focus series. Why is the body good to think with? My first note invites to engage with aging and disability as categories and lived experiences that offer the complexity to expand our understanding of the relationships between body and state, and think about care as a process that shapes these relationships from above, when states and institutions decide who deserves care or not, and from below, when interpersonal and community care become a vital source of survival and agency building. When I have conversations with older women who joined the 2020 uprising in Belarus and then had to flee repressions, they always start their stories of resistance from their past experiences of structural violence. Surviving the Chernobyl disaster and learning from Western media how to protect their and their children's bodies, staff reductions in the 90s and how they were fired while being on maternity leave, and how then, being a single mother, they had to combine several jobs and rely on kinship networks to provide care for children and to resist this crisis. I think there's something that can be theorized with the concept that Oksana insightfully shared, the depletion. So we can definitely talk more about it in a Q&A session. These past experiences of disruption informed women's present resilience to oppose authoritarian violence by restructuring and recirculating key relationships that often span beyond family and state. Being displaced, they rely on their kins, former neighbors, comrades from the protest chats, and former cellmates, and those with whom they marched together on the streets in Belarus. When the emergency happens, such as illness or broken leg, political imprisonment of a family member or comrade, these communities step up and support them. In such cases, the embodied memories of the past and present violence shape ideology and everyday practice that keeps communities connected across spaces and over time, inside and outside the repressive state. My second reflection relates to body's mobility and weighting. Ethnography of the daily life of exiled communities insightfully teaches us to attend to weighting as an idea and practice. Waiting for change in your home country often means refusal to situate your body in the local context and continuing in investment in connections with communities back home. I still refuse to learn Polish because I do not belong here. My place is at home. I'm temporary here, said one of my interlocutors a year ago, a retired woman and mother of a political prisoner. Waiting for change while fleeing a rapidly growing political crisis and war often means being stuck in liminality and experiencing unending present. As a researcher of Syrian communities in exile, Charlotte Al-Khalili insightfully framed it. Such state of body and mind exacerbates precarities and exhaustion and makes bodies unprepared for prolonged living without their habitual worlds. In addition, bodies that were supported in the moment of emergency can soon become unwelcomed, abandoned, and labeled as national threat as political narratives and access to resources change and shift in the host country. Finally, my last reflection asks how misfitting bodies, using Gerald Thompson term, experience collective spaces of resistance and everyday realities of political exile. One of the older women in her 60s recently shared with me, I usually leave rallies and marches earlier. Once in Minsk, I had a very high pulse, up to 200. I had a Holter monitor on my body, and it started making intense noise in the middle of the rally. Everybody was scared. I tried to explain what was happening and to calm people down. My heart literally cannot bear it. It took a long time for me to recognize it and learn how to talk about it with others. Now I usually say, don't pay attention if I leave earlier. I need to leave to keep my heart safe. This narrative highlights how embodiment as physical and discursive practice is vital for building knowledge about the experiences of others, as Oksana powerfully discussed it in the beginning of the conversation, and as many of you contributed to this discussion. Learning from the limits and discomforts of the body takes time and effort. It complicates the state of things and makes us pay attention to the life worlds in its complexity and continuity. And as many of us agree today, from both epistemological and methodological standpoints, documenting and learning from misfitting body experiences make it possible to challenge the invisibility of structural and political violence. And I think I will stop here to be mindful of time and have a lot of questions for you all, and thank you.
Thank you, Volha. Thank you, everyone, for contributing to this discussion. Well, as you can see, we have a lot of topics here on the table, and it's of course my duty to somehow bring order to this. First, I think I would like to ask you whether you have any comments or questions to other panelists, or something that comes into your mind or that you would like to comment on?
I have a comment.
Go ahead, Alex.
I just wanted to say, I really learned a lot from what everyone was saying, but I was thinking of like two things in particular. I think when Oksana started off with her very concrete story, which was very like touching, and I could feel. I wanted to say about that, you know, this kind of marginalization of autoethnography as a method, and also thinking from the body. I really like that you brought out that, like, you know, despite what other people feel about it, it's okay to like talk about the pain and what is felt and the vulnerability. And that kind of actually just reminded me also of Ruth Behar's book, The Vulnerable Observer, where, you know, she's detaching this kind of, you know, boundary between the observed, who is supposed to be vulnerable, right? And then the observer, who is not vulnerable, right? But putting them together and saying, no, the person who's observing is also vulnerable in these ways, and we need to be honest and transparent about that. So yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about that.
Anyone else? Okay, I see. So Oksana and Volha, you have. I was thinking about the question of methods, since, you know, depletion, you said, Oksana, it implies observing in time, if I understood it right. And you know, we as ethnographers, we have usually a limited time to do observation. So how do we yeah, observe these violences except in this particular moment? And also, you know, being as ethnography is looking at people in their particular historical, social, and context, and, you know, trying to unwind all these different webs they are moving within. So, you know, how do you do it in this particular case? And you know, I think, you know, what's so interesting about the body, that it gives you this one object that you can look at, and then, you know, take a lot of different threads out of it, and to uncode also violence or or gender or things like that. So how does the component of time is here relevant?
Wow. Yeah, very interesting question. I can start by saying that I wouldn't maybe be able to give like a detailed methodological response in terms of what it means to do like a longitudinal study. But I think when I started to think about this and to look at depletion over time, I was doing it on the one hand in the context of the growing attention to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that suddenly put this specific armed violence, specific colonial violence on the map. And it felt like the world, including an academic world, only now discovered that region, that form of violence, that historical continuity, and then bringing to the awareness the fact that this violence started before and will continue after the attention to it subsides is part of the intervention that I think we as knowledge producers can make. In terms of solidarity, to me, it translates into the political economy of movement building, political economy of knowledge production, and the political economy of post-war recovery, which is one of the areas of my activist engagement. When we think about structures that are put in place or are dismantled through war and violence, these structures, in context of a state, for example, especially post-socialist state that's transitioning, are moving more and more towards neoliberal, privatized systems of care. And after whatever peace deal will be reached or whatever victory Ukraine will achieve, we all hope it will be the one that is mostly in the interest of Ukrainian people. These invisible costs will keep falling on the shoulders of families and communities unless we put in place a system of social protection and economy that takes part of that burden on it. And in terms of academia, many of us have experienced or watched these temporary places of a scholarship or a scholar at risk being placed here and there for 6 months or for a year, and that being seen as the sign of solidarity that then again subside and decrease unless we have structures in place that allow for more long-term engagement and structural shift. And I'm not only talking about Ukraine in general, this is about decolonizing academia, and creating spaces and structures for knowledge producers from the periphery. To me, that kind of solidarity is kind of put to question because of its immediacy and connection to media discourse that subsides very quickly. And last thing I will say that this kind of thinking falls into what feminist security studies frame as a continuum of violence. And they allow us to see violence as something that doesn't only start when the war begins as armed violence, and also doesn't end when armed violence or physical violence ends. The feminist lens, an intersectional lens on violence, allows us to see different forms of violence, economic, discursive, structural, as it precedes physical manifestations and also continues beyond what the state or the military perspectives on security allow us to uncover. And that's why it's important to keep engaging with bodies, especially with vulnerable bodies. And I will gesture here to Bolha that fall outside of the necessary productive subjects that the state and the society kind of should be supporting. And then just are left to their own communities to be taken care of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. That's very, very rich. So should we move on with violence, since I think it was in each of your contribution? If I may, I was interested, Alexa, you just signaled a lot of issues in your contribution, and I understand it's, there is not much time, but can you make maybe more or just say something more about racism? Just what are the local discourses of racism and how your presence there, revealed what to you? Because also I think racism is also something Masha is, talking about. But it's, from my perspective, and correct me if I'm wrong, Masha, it's more about, whiteness, critical whiteness. Whereas in your case, it's obviously this is not, but it is about racism. So can you give us more detail or knowledge here?
Yeah, I wrote an article about anti-Blackness in the field. I guess it might have been published last year or this year. I don't remember. But yeah, as in regard to racism in the field, and how, in particular, I like to use terms like anti-Blackness, because anti-Blackness is more, I think, of a fluid term. It's also can be something structural, right? But thinking about everyday practices of anti-Blackness. So not only in regards to my own body in the field, but how I think about, say, language, right? did someone go to Russian school or did they go to Kyrgyz school? And what does that mean for that person to only be able to speak in Kyrgyz when they need, like, to go to the hospital for medical assistance as a trans woman? How is that person then simultaneously being racialized, but also there are gendered aspects? They're dealing with transphobia and also anti-Blackness through language, right? Or their ability or non-ability to speak Russian. And so thinking about it in these ways, and thinking about how my own body, as I navigate this space, in particular, I guess I could just give one meaty example. You know, when I'm in Bishkek, people don't necessarily, well, actually, I kind of want to tie it to what Masha was saying, because I think there is an element of racism that is happening to Masha, because the assumption that she is a sex worker is like attached to Eastern Europeanness, and people's like ideas of hypersexuality that is attached to that particular body, right? And it may be working in a different way for me, right? My body is also hypersexual as a person who is Black. And people have all sorts of assumptions about that. When I'm crossing borders, in particular, the border between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, I face a lot of issues of anti-Blackness. People assume, or not people, but border control often assumes that I am, you know, my passport is not real sometimes because it is an American passport. So the assumption is that I'm somehow, you know, an African who has now a fake American passport. Or, you know, I have been accused of engaging in sex work also, not particularly at the border, but, you know, by taxi drivers, stuff like this, like everyday instances of this. And these things, although they're unfortunate, they've made me think about how global discourses of anti-Blackness and also visual regimes from the past come into the present and come into other contexts in which one could be in. You know, I guess I'm a part of a group of Black Americans who, I mean, I can admit that sometimes you want to escape or find reprieve from racism in the US, and you go somewhere else to find that reprieve, only to find out that discourses from long ago and ideas of Blackness from long ago catch up to you in that space as well. So this is something that like mainly influences my inquiries into how race is functioning specifically in Kyrgyzstan for bodies who are out of place, especially queer bodies, because I also understand queerness as attached to Blackness. I don't want to get too like theoretically deep in the weeds with it, but thinking of Horton Spillers, her distinction between body and flesh, and what it means to ungender Blackness, and then reinscribe ideas of sexuality back into the flesh. So I don't know if that answered your question, but again, that might have been a lot of stuff.
Totally. You know why? Because, you know, there is this really important and interesting aspect of anti-Blackness that you just mentioned, because you talked about visibility. And, you know, for me also, the aspect of visibility is irrelevant as a queer person and, you know, coming from Central and Eastern Europe and Germany. But it's a very, you know, liberal notion. And also, I'm kind of annoyed by a lot of Western scholars still, you know, reproducing the narrative about queer lives in the East, that they are invisible and that they are, you know, but that's obviously not true. They're just not visible to them. So, you know, this anti-Blackness is another aspect that needs to be, it's just super interesting to see these intersections and how this visibility or the notion of visibility or non-visibility gaining another meaning with the concept of anti-blackness, or with you and the field, and what you experience, and what you produce, what kind of knowledge about race. And Masha, I was wondering also, hang on, I have to look into my my notes. So language often is, seen as a connector between individual and society, and collective, or joining, body and mind, and language as a way of embodying culture. I was wondering if your material, with the concepts of queerness or queering, you can correct me if I'm wrong, how with your material you can contribute to critical whiteness, from the region, from that perspective, from the marginalized perspective, because you're pledging for this perspective. So what do you think? What do you think will be a way, maybe? Just
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I also wanted to address, this notion, whether do I write about racism in this text? And I would say, for me, it is very critical and very helpful to differentiate between different also forms of systemical oppression and violences. And for me, it was also crucial to use this word linguicism, right? To elaborate on the specific hierarchies which are formed also in different societies. And I am also not sure if it was successful in this text, or if I would do it also in a different way right now. This violence of Russification of Ukrainians, and of having adopted also certain habitus, certain words, and having incorporated since generations the language, and using it also. And I think from now I would theorize it more sharply or more concrete. And I am not sure racism is here the right word to describe this power relation. So for me, it is crucial to find different words to describe this power relation, which is now very visible. And Oksana has very aptly also has put our discussion into remembering those who are dying because of this violence, right? And I think also while thinking about inequalities of being an Eastern European queer body, crossing borders, or entering academic spaces, or trying to speak up, I know that there is a body of texts which try to theorize this as an anti-European, anti-Eastern European racism. And I know that there are such scholars, for example, as Alyosha Tudor, who also suggest to differentiate between migratism and racism as a different power relations. And I think this is a discussion which is open, which is still happening also and for example, in German context, this is very prominent discussion where people are trying to find the apt wording. And So my way in this text was rather to look indeed into these linguistical differences and also to find appropriate wording to describe those micro exclusions in a way which was also quite personal. I hope I have answered your question in a way, and yeah.
Sure, of course. Volha, I have a question to you. And maybe before I pose the question, I'm just going to say to the audience, and feel free to pose your questions as well in the Q&A box. And we will include this include them in the conversation. So I understand that, a big element of your work is work on affects and emotions. And I was wondering, what are the ways of grasping these very, emotions are usually also very, while they are embodied, they're also, culturally coded. So, and because of that, they can be very specific or localized, or, so I was wondering, what are the ways to grasp them? What are the ways to describe these subtle differences, or subtle gestures, and how do we make claims as anthropologists to have understood this in a particular way?
Thank you so much, Pavel, for this question. That's a complex puzzle, of course, for me too. I do not work specifically with emotion, but the storytelling and ethnographic interviews that I have in my project, and endless conversations with people, repetitive conversations over time, because the violence is so close. It's definitely emotions are present, and especially when it comes to describing experiences of like bodily experiences, it is hard to interpret what does it mean. For example, the quote that I shared, what does it mean? Is it exposure to violence, and this person should stay safe and do not join this community events, and it's a form of violence too, pushing this person to be in community space? Or is it something that means a lot to this person, and the agency that is here is manifesting in these emotions too, through learning how to negotiate what she feels and discuss it with others. So this is definitely, I don't have very simple answers how it happens, and how do we interpret these things as ethnographers and researchers. But I think the closer we are to people and stay in dialogue about it and explicitly discuss it, what does it mean? What do you mean by this? I believe in the storytelling as agency building, and especially for women I'm talking with, it is so important for them to bring this continuity of these experiences that they have in the form of storytelling about their past and present, and through their life course. Why many of them say, I never supported this political regime, and this is my only chance now to openly talk about it because of this massive one. So that's a lot of complexity here, but learning about body through conversation is also possible, because I think it brings the relational perspective, how body is a network of relationships, especially in the emergency when something is happening with our body. as we discussed today too, how different people and different bodies connect to deal with some issues and to support each other. That was my long answer. Sorry if I missed something.
Thank you. Thanks, Volha. We have a question from the audience. Alexander Biereskin is asking Alexa and Masha, how do you work with or reflect on your body when encountering invasion in your embodiment space? I understand you use such situations for your academic writing. Do you use any other techniques such as art?
Masha, did you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Alexander. I indeed do write also poetry, yeah, and also I think the field of like community organizing and yeah, creative writing workshops are the way also which help to deal with such topics. What about you, Alexa?
Yeah, hi Sasha. Yeah, I actually art is very important for me. And not that, I mean, I will engage in doing art, but I typically learn actually a lot about embodiment and thinking about the boundaries of the body through art and how Black artists specifically, I don't want to butcher her name, but her name is, I believe, you know, the portrait of Michelle Obama that's pretty famous, where she's not necessarily how you would understand Blackness to be. They use kind of a different tone, stuff like this, kind of this anti-portraiture movement. So I think art actually influences mostly how I also write about embodiments of Blackness and what assumptions that are held to Blackness, and what expectations there are to perform Blackness in some ways. So yeah, but I haven't engaged particularly in art itself, but I think art is a huge aspect of my thought process. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Masha and Alexa. Super interesting. Yeah, we have one more question, and then please feel free to any one of you, because there is no, addressee of that question, from an anonymous audience member. Racism and body are obvious when it comes to non-white migrants. So how does migrantophobia manifest itself against white people from Eastern Europe?
I can maybe start, and if somebody wants to join. Because I work with moving communities from Poland to Lithuania, from Lithuania to Poland, I would not say that people that I'm talking with encounter specifically migrantophobia, but it is definitely about something that how bodies are labeled differently over time. And for example, for Belarusian communities in 2020, when they were welcomed as kind of victims of the dictatorship, over time, this ideology has changed, and many people experience legalization issues. And especially like in Lithuania, there is a strong narrative now against Belarusians as national threat for many reasons, of course. But yeah, I would say maybe you can add, but migrantophobia maybe not the only term that we can use here, like the only word, and we can look deeper in what, as Marta said, we need to differentiate systemic violence. Yeah. So what is behind this migrantophobia, and how it can spread wider in terms of different experiences and how we can name it. And here ethnography, I think, is very helpful, how we can read specific everyday experiences and bring other concepts or words that can describe them.
Okay. Well, and also I think if I may just drop one sentence to that, add one thing to that. I think we live in time when, you know, racism is not just pinned down to the skin color or, you know, epidermics. It's just, you know, a broad intersectional ways of building hierarchies, exclusions, and essentializations based on, and I think, you know, we showed this very well, or all your contributions, you know, that it's also language, body performances, it's, you know, class and other intersections. I think we are just running out of time. So as I don't have a recap, I don't have you know, any nice and funny way of ending this. I just want to thank you. Thank you for giving your insights from the field. Thank you for giving your insights to your thoughts and, you know, your work and how you think about these super important issues. Thank you for sharing it. I'm really happy, and, you know, I'm really admiring your work. It's really fascinating. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight or this afternoon for wherever you are. I'll just hand over to Alicia. Is that okay?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. You know, the usual Zoom thing. Great. Well, thank you all again for joining us today. On behalf of the organizing centers, ACs, all the co-sponsoring institutions, I'd like to thank Pavel, Masha, Alexa, Oksana, and Volha, as well as our audience members for such a deeply meaningful conversation today. Before we close, I'd just like to remind you all that our 5th session will be taking place next Friday, February 7th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and Sarah will drop the link to register for that session in the chat momentarily. This panel is entitled Centering the Body in Pedagogy and Teaching and will feature Fran Bernstein from New York University as our moderator, as well as guest speakers Linda Lapina from Roskilde University and Nadia Chushak from the National University of Kyiv. As mentioned before, all panels in this series will be recorded, professionally captioned, and made available within a few days after each session on the program pages of the 3 organizing centers. If you have any questions about accessibility or wish to request accommodations for any other future sessions, please contact cees@osu.edu 2 weeks ahead of time. And again, that is cees@osu.edu. And with that, we hope you all have a good morning, evening, or afternoon, and take care.